Peace and power, family. I have Dr. Leonard Jeffries, his wife, Dr. Rosalind Jeffries, and a special guest in the back. And we're on our way to a tribute to Dr. John Henry Clarke. And I have Dr. J. You don't see him too much on his own Facebook page because his schedule is very, very difficult. And even though you do have Facebook on your phone, correct, Dr. J?
Yes.
But you don't always have time to check it and make posts, right?
But we're going to expand our internet reach, definitely.
You're going to expand your internet reach. And because, the young people, they're saying that, they're not accepting scholars who can't navigate these tools. So they're saying if you're outdated with these tools, you're not in the game, and so you're not really relevant. So today I want to talk a little bit about how this information filters, who are the people that make these big arguments about things, how important, if at all, the question of Kemet is in the scheme of the larger things, and then have you talk about Cheikh Anta Diop, your relationship. You're one of the two Black Americans, African Americans that had a relationship with Cheikh Anta Diop in the 50s, right? So let's just talk a little bit about, in the academia, Dr. Jeffries, you've been involved in the beginning with African Studies at Columbia University, right? And Mama J. Rosalind, Dr. Rosalind Jeffries has been involved earlier in this thing of discovering or rediscovering Africa for African people. Two of the pioneers. What was the issue about Africa? And why is there a Leonard Jeffries, a Cheikh Anta Diop, a Dr. Rosalind Jeffries, a Molefi Asante, James Turner, Dr. John Henry Clarke, Dr. Ben? Why? What makes all of you so important in the scheme of these things?
Well, certainly, I appreciate an opportunity to have a discussion, and a deep discussion, if we can call it that, in terms of the creation of knowledge, how that knowledge is used to expand other knowledge. We're not just talking about facts and dates and names and places, because if we limit ourselves to that, we get what I call a paralysis of analysis. We focus on a few individuals or their circumstances and their contribution, and we miss the larger flow of socialization and acculturations. Socialization is how you get your foundation, how you become who you are. Acculturation is how you fit into society. So we're talking about systems. My important contribution to this explosion of knowledge has been to put an emphasis on the systems component. Everything is systems related, and we often miss that because we began to focus on individual circumstances, personalities, and events, and so we don't see the flow that links economics. The first important understanding of systems is economics. Economics is your creative productive capability, and then you relate that to the management of the economics, and that's the politics. That's the administrative and management capability. Nothing functions if we don't have a foundation that includes economics and politics. And politics, we're not talking about individuals, we're talking about the systems of control and the management and the development of things. But none of that, economics and politics, are the foundation of everything, even the functioning of your body, the cells of your body, the functioning of the universe. But culture is the key. And at the top of this triangle of knowledge, or this pyramid of knowledge, is the question of culture. Culture tells you not what kind of drums to utilize, or what kind of musical instruments to make as part of your ceremonial culture. Culture are the deep thoughts, the deep understandings of how we relate to the universe, how families relate to each other in terms of what we call ethnicity, how we deal with the values that create this cement that holds cultures together. So I move past the personalities, the individuals, and see them how they work together. So my contribution in that sense is what I call pyramid analysis. And then using that pyramid, I speak in terms of 50-year turning points of history. Well, Dr. John Kennedy Clark was the historian, and he looks at the larger flow of history, so he speaks in terms of hundreds of years of history. So we had to compromise on that. My political analysis wedded me to this 50-year turning point. His looking at the flow of history wedded him to a 200-year understanding. But he combined the two analysis together by asking me to do an introduction to his book, Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust. And in it, I lay out the 50-year turning point of history as well as the 200-year historical process and wed them together. That systems analysis that I reference has its most monumental work in the work of Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, who over a period of many years, with a host of others working with him, turned history upside right and continued a process that began in the 50s and exploded on us in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And so this period of history I refer to as the 50-year turning point of history, 1945 to 1995. And in that period of time, so many flows, ebbs and flow of information and movements and relationships that went beyond the personal and the familiar to the universal and the global. So the 50-year turning point of history that this new explosion of information has given us has to be grasped. And I use 1945 because that's when a group of African peoples got together after the destruction of World War II and the devastation of white-on-white crime that it represented. And it continues from the devastation of World War I, in which tens of millions, 100 million people were killed or maimed by white folks, white-on-white crime. So within these two historical periods of global understanding, you had World War I and its 100 million destroyed or injured. Then you have a period of 10 years of great prosperity, but then all of a sudden, boom, the system economically collapsed and you have the Great Depression worldwide. And so within the context, the global community was shaken economically, politically, and culturally, because culturally a monster emerged in terms of deep values and understandings that the European and others tried to impose. And so in between the destruction of World War I and World War II emerged philosophies and ideas. Marxism evolved into communism, and fascism evolved into various forms, including Nazism. And so the culture component of this world that we're in was shaken by these deep negative forces trying to control the human family, control the flow of knowledge, the flow of human development, the flow of economics. And so we need to see our enormous explosion on the world scene in the context of a world going amok. In other words, crazies. Hitler is not just a single reference. Hitler is the continuation out of Hitler of a policy of this monster concept of the master race, of certain individuals feeling that they are more important than even God. And so don't isolate Hitler. Weave him into what was happening in Spain, what was happening in Italy with Mussolini, what was happening in Spain with Franco, what was happening in Russia with Stalin. And so when you see this global insanity forming itself. Then you have to understand where Africa comes in. No domination of the world's economics, politics, and culture can take place without the most important part of the human family, the richest part of the global community, Africa. And so World War I involved who was going to control the great wealth of Africa, and World War II involved who was going to control the great wealth of Africa. And once the Allied forces won, then the economics, politics, and culture of their new world was being formed. And so in 45, they left Geneva, where you had the League of Nations, and they went to San Francisco in June 1945 in order to form a new global formation dealing with economics, politics, and culture. And that was the United Nations. And so the United Nations was formed in June of 1945 on the ashes of white-on-white death, the likes of which the world has never seen. In a 30-year period, millions, tens of millions of white folks had killed each other, burned their cities, destroyed their libraries, knocked down their monumental buildings. That's a part of the history that is left out. We need to study that. I've been there, and so I appreciate it, knowing what that mess was all about. I've seen what the Germans built in Hamburg, Germany, in order to protect it. I've seen the framework of what they call the concentration camps. And so we have to see the world in its global sense and not just in the African sense. But Africans were the victims and targets. But what was the African response? The European met to divide up the world again and put Western European peoples on top. But the big thing was the colonies. In order for this new wealth, this new economics, this new politics to work, you had to control the African lands. But African peoples and other Asian peoples were meeting also. World War II had freed them of the colonial strongholds. In fact, the Europeans had to arm African people and Asian people in order to beat the monstrosity of Nazism and other forms of fascism. And so these black people, once armed to fight for the European colonials, had sense enough to know this was their great moment to leap forward into their freedom. And so the Asians began to do it. Asians in the South began to follow Asians in the North. The Chinese began to struggle for their freedom, and out of that comes the Mao Zedong era. In Indonesia, the Sukarno and other leaders of Indonesia who had fought against the Japanese for the Dutch realized that now was the chance for them to take this major leap toward freedom. And so 1945, Africans met in Manchester, England, from the global African community. Who was there? W.E.B. Du Bois, the grand man. For the last 60, 70 years, from 1900 to this period, here was this grand mind, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the head of the 5th Pan-African Conference, and who was also there as an assistant and as the secretary. The great Kwame Nkrumah, who had just finished an experience with African Americans and African Caribbeans and continental Africa at Lincoln University, and then he moved from Lincoln to spend a couple of years in Europe, in London in particular, in England, and then he joined the others in Manchester. Who was there? From Jamaica, you had a host of others, including Dudley Thompson, who became one of the great young men who continued this struggle. Who was there? Professor Edward Scobie in RAF uniform, just as was Dudley Thompson. And so that we need to see a mix from Guyana. Ross McConnell, who came from the British Guyana community, and from the islands off of South America, you had Trinidad, Tobago, C.L.R. James, Ross McConnell, C.L.R. James, and the complement to Ross McConnell in Guyana. And eventually that complementarity included a young group of scholars, including Walter Rodney. So you need to see the generations of elders, the new mix coming in, and the youngsters pulling together to produce this enormity that we call the Pan-African movement. And from America, you had other giants. From Jamaica, you had Marcus Garvey's wife. And so with this mix from various parts of our African world, they came up with a plan for African redemption, African resurrection, rebirth, African revolution. And so 1945 was the conference in Manchester where a vision of a new Africa, economically, politically, and culturally was formed. And then in 1946, the Indonesians told the Dutch to go back to Europe. We're no longer going to accept your domination. And so the weaponry that they used against the Japanese, they were now prepared to use against the Dutch. So in 1945, you had the African independence movement. 1946, you had the Indonesians. 1947, India, led by Gandhi and others, began to move into an independence posture that led to India's independence in 1947, out from under the British yoke. 1948, the problems in Palestine resulted in the state of Israel. 1949, Mao Zedong led his people to victory in China. And then when you got into the 50s, there was this enormous change in Egypt. Gamal Nasser and Naguib become the first black people to rule in Egypt in 2,000 years. And so after 1952 with Gamal Nasser, then you had Naguib, you had in Iran, Mossadegh declaring that Iran and its oil is going to be part of this world movement.
One quick second. How long do we have to get there?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. So, Dr. J.
But let's continue right into from 40, just to show this movement. It's not an isolated thing. It's not limited to a few scholars. It's not limited to a few institutions. It's a global change of peoples of color, African, Asian peoples, Latin American peoples, taking their destiny in their hand. And so after General Naguib and Nasser in 53, in 52, Mossadegh in Iran in 53, 54, the Vietnamese defeat the French at Dien Bien Phu and establish a process of their independence. 1954 also. 1955, you began to get this movement seriously spreading to the African continent in Southern Africa. And so by 1950, the Bandung Conference, 1955, included some of our great political personalities. Adam Clayton Powell left America to represent the African American community. By 1956, the Sudan becomes independent. In 1957, Ghana becomes independent. 1958, Ghana helps Guinea maintains its independence. 1959, Cuba is independent. 1960, the Congo gets its independence in June. Nigeria in October. And French-speaking nations in that fall, a dozen of them become free. So this explosion of independence is the new thinking, the new nations that has to be put together economically, politically, and culturally. And so that movement in 59-60 hits America in important waves. The United States, 1959, is when somebody called Paul Robeson said, "Here I stand," to the world community. 1959, someone called W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about the world and Africa. 1959, a brother elder who became my godfather and my wife's godfather, Reverend James H. Robinson did his autobiography, A Road Without Turning, and he developed the Operation Crossroads Africa program because he had gone to school with Nkrumah. So 1957, when Ghana became independent, Nkrumah asked for African peoples to come to Ghana to join in their independence. And Reverend Robinson and others developed organizations such as Operation Crossroads Africa. So you have to see this enormous movement of linkages between people of color and African, Asians, and Latin American peoples establishing a new formulation. But that new formulation, economically and politically, needed a cultural component. 1959, when Robeson was doing his struggle. 1959 is when Cheikh Anta Diop took on the intellectual tradition of the French, and I was there. He had tried 3 times to defend a dissertation on the significance of Africa to ancient Africa. And the leaders of this movement, his elders, Alioune Diop and Madame Diop, formed Présence Africaine, which was the think tank. It was the organization that pulled people from Martinique and Guadeloupe, like Aimé Césaire, and connecting them with the young Cheikh Anta Diop and a host of with the Fanon. There's this mix of minds hooking up to put a new world of people of color together has to be understood. 1959, physically, I left America. After I finished college and did a study of the urban crisis, I left America and met this new world of people coming from all of these countries who were trying to put a new mindset together. In order to do it, they had to control information. They had to create a flow of information that was socialization and acculturation into our consciousness, meaning peoples of color's consciousness, and not into the consciousness of the Europeans or consciousness of misguided folks from the Arab world. There was a big struggle in the Arab world. Gamal Nasser and Naguib had to struggle for Africanized Muslims to have a place in the sun, because they were dominated by those who felt that their role was to link with the white world. So 1959 changed my life. Before that point, I wanted to be the lawyer to save the world, to be the Thurgood Marshall. 1959, when I met Cheikh Anta Diop, and more important than Cheikh Anta Diop was his mentor, Alioune Diop, who set up the great victory for him to finally get his dissertation. And he produced this great work from a series of work he began to produce in the 50s and on into the 60s. So finally, in 1980, he was able to culminate his research on civilization and barbarism, an authentic anthropology of what has been a stolen legacy. 1954, you had George G.M. James and the stolen legacy. And he was dealing with Greece, not necessarily dealing directly with the African continent, but he was saying that the Greek culture comes out of the African experience, the high Greek culture. So the explosion of knowledge to give us a cultural base from which to spring has to be seen in these 50s and 60s. And I personally had the experience of being in the mix. Dr. John Henry Clark was there in 58 in Europe at the conference in Rome when they formed AMSAC, the African Society of Culture. But this cultural component, I want to read Cheikh Anta Diop's dedication to this work. I dedicate this book to the memory of Alioune Diop, who died on the battlefield of African culture. Let me repeat that. I dedicate this book to the memory of Alioune Diop, his mentor, who died on the battlefield of African culture. Alioune, you knew what you came to do on this earth. A life entirely dedicated to others. Nothing for yourself, everything for others. A heart filled with goodness and generosity. A soul steeped in nobility. A spirit always supreme. Simplicity personified. Did the beginning want to provide us with an example? an ideal of perfection by calling you into existence. Alas, the terrestrial community to which you knew how to convey better than anyone else the message of human truthfulness that sprang from the innermost depths of your being was deprived of you too soon. But the remembrance of you will never be erased from the memory of African peoples to whom you dedicated your life. That is why I'm dedicating this book to your memory in witness of a brotherly friendship that is stronger than time. This is the type of relationship that was developed by these various scholars. They developed a brotherhood, a familyhood, a sisterhood that has helped change the world. And so when those of us get a chance to get a little piece of the knowledge, we have missed the main point of the coming together of African peoples to have a global impact, of putting history right. Civilization comes out of the African experience. Barbarism comes out of the northern cradle, the European experience, or the cradle with lesser than. That is the experience that comes out of the so-called Middle East. So we are building on this love and respect, this cultural dynamic, the likes of which very few people understand.
We're going to continue. So we are returning from our celebration with Dr. John Henry Clark, and we have Dr. Leonard Jeffries, and we have Mama J in the car, and it gives us an opportunity to ask a couple of questions about the meaning of our work, and I think that that's a good way to table it. Dr. Jeffries, how is in these intellectual battles, meaning from Dr. Sheka Anta Diop's African Origin of Civilization and the UNESCO conference and symposiums, the peopling of Nile Valley, this fight for Africa's place, is it there to make us feel good, or is it searching for a certain amount of truth? And how are these ideas populated? Are they done on the street? Are they done in the communities? Or is it trickled down from the university to the other educational centers? How's this information? Describe the flow of information and tell me why it matters.
Well, I'm glad we're raising these issues. We constantly have to raise them to get some clarity. And so we don't hesitate in dealing at whatever level when it comes to finding the truth that of the African world experience. And so, but we had to have a historical perspective. And so I've been trying to say, looking at things historically, that we're in a period of what I call the 50-year turning point of history in favor of African peoples. And I date this 50-year turning point from 1945 to 1995. In that period of time, we've been through three important movements of our people. Number one, we've been through a process of the gathering of information about who and what we are. And so we can refer to that as a period of revolutionary change and understanding. And from 1945 to 1995, coming together at all levels, at the level of the scholars, at the level of those great institutions, at the level of movements and organizations, at the level of institutions, there has been a quantum leap into the African truth. Before 1945, African people were not even considered a part of the flow of the history of humanity. But in the 50s, for example, we had scholars like our brother Stolen Legacy by George G.M. James was one of those great moments in which the challenge of European civilization based upon the Greeks was made. At that same period of time that this brother was, George C.M. James was making his contribution, at Howard University in the 50s was a brother, Professor Leo Hansberry, who I don't think ever completed his PhD because the subject matter he was dealing with was so controversial: the African origin of humankind, the African development of culture and civilization. But Leo Hansberry built a base at a Howard University, and he developed what was called the Hansberry School. And that school allowed Howard to become a premier institution for the distribution of the African knowledge. And so Hansberry had with him other greats, and one of the younger persons who turned out to be an elder of significance was Chancellor Williams, who produced the Destruction of African Civilization and the Rebirth of African Civilization. And so that there were schools of knowledge developed in the 50s in New York. In the 40s and 50s, you had the African History Club developed around Dr. Huggins and John Jackson. These were the mentors of Dr. John Henry Clark. And by the time Dr. Clark got in the mix, he was linking up with people like Dr. Joseph Ben-Jochannan. Dr. Clark's relationship was with not only the scholars, but also with the community movers and shakers, and also with conscious organizations such as the Garvey movement. Carlos Cook's revival of the Garvey movement in the 50s is an example of that. So there was an explosion, a revolution of activities in the 50s and 60s that we benefited from. And so we have to begin to understand that the revolution activities on the African continent, in the Caribbean, in the streets of America, in our institutions, was not isolated. It was a part of an African world revolution. Dr. Clark's latest book summarizes his understanding of that, and that book was Africans at the Crossroads, the African World Revolution.
So you bring up an interesting point, that the reason for our work, the meaning of our work, is connected to our struggle.
Yes, destroying the systems of our oppression, destroying the remnants of slavery, destroying colonialism and the new form of colonialism, neo-colonialism. African peoples were preparing themselves for this great world struggle, which led to the building of African states from these colonies and African regional entities from these new states, and a Pan-African continental relationship from the 50-something African nations.
Now, for Sheikh Anta Diop, posed that the meaning of the word Kemet, as they were trying to take Egypt out of Africa, the Nile Valley out of Africa, that particular reason. Sheikh Anta Diop, Dr. Theophila Beng, and others did great research to start the process of looking at what things mean in the language and how it applies to things like place names and so now there is this big debate, and this is interesting. So I'm gonna pose it for you for a particular perspective. There's an argument that Kemet does not mean black people. It means riparian. It means wet, damp ground, abundance of grass, farmland, and by some methods, linguistic methods, this is what a group of people are finding out. Dr. Diop, of course, said that Kemet is connected to black people. This little argument has become a big argument, right? And I want your perspective on how does this argument in itself benefit black people? I mean, and where should this argument really be? Should it be among the grassroots people, or should it be among the scholars? And even if it's among the scholars, how significant is it in the larger scheme of the work?
Well, a good question that we have to deal with. There's an explosion of activity, and that includes an explosion of knowledge and information. And so it's not surprising that there's difficulty, because people come at things from a different perspective. And so there are those who have been influenced by the system of white supremacy, which has dominated and colonized knowledge and colonized concepts in relationship to knowledge. And so Africans understood that after World War II, and these great scholars, whether you're talking about Cheikh Anta Diop from the Senegal family, or Aimé Césaire from the family in the Caribbean, or Cheikh Anta Diop from the African American, Africans all over were beginning to look at this process. And so they began to use the various tools, linguistic tools, scientific tools, studying even spirituality and how the definitions of things are. So there is a coordination of enlightening African peoples that can be confused when people have a limited understanding. Cheikh Anta Diop said culture is the key, but he also said linguistics is necessary. And he began to study not just science and radio. He began to study languages. And
so
he partnered with people like Theophile Obenga, who was a linguist, and they began to break down, from an African perspective, these definitions.
Okay. Yeah, so Leonard is right, because language, all you have to do is go into the Meta-Netra hieroglyphics, and you see how you write the word Kemet, and you write it with a mound of charcoal, you know. So the charcoal is the charcoal element. It's the black. And then the word for black people is Kemeti-U. And with the word Kem in as a root part of it. So that the aspect of the blackness of land was the black silt that came from the southern part of Africa during the inundation of the Nile, and that was the black rich enrichment of the land.
I'm sorry
so
that the young people
the
do
land
not.
And the people got to be connected to the point that when the Greeks came along, they coined the word Ethiopia. And what did the word Ethiopia mean but black? People who rode in their chariots so close to the sun until there was the charcoal again, the soot.
Doctors, the young group of people, they're saying that the I6 glyph does not always mean black, and in most cases it doesn't mean black, and that Kemet has many different definitions, like completion, like compilation. It doesn't always mean black, so they question the Kim. So professors, I'm sorry that the young people are now saying there's some other tools that that the work that you've done
Chem
is dated.
is for chemistry. So if you want to say it means beyond black, and then in studying anything organic, there's a carbon element. You know, carbon dioxide, carbon, anything that was living, carbon, testing, so that there's a science involved in the whole thing.
I would agree, but there has been this big, wide debate. And
but the debate should go on, and you are right to raise it. And the elements that we need to look at it come from various forms. Ross has mentioned the importance of the linguistic, And Sheikh Anta Diop says the linguistic is key, and so he mastered the study of the language.
They are challenging that.
But that's cool. That's their right. That's their privilege. But he not only has the support of his own works, but a linguist, Theophile Obenga, from the heart of Africa, from the Congo, Brazzaville. Theophile Obenga became one of the premier linguists in dealing with the ancient African history, and so you can have various points of view clashing with each other, but still that does not mean that everybody who comes up with speculations and ideas has that foundation of truth, that this work has been done over the last 50 years and has given us...
They're questioning the African, they're questioning the scholarly authority.
They have a right to question that, but that's not going to change the sweep of history. It has been established with conferences and the French, while we were meeting with Haile Selassie and Dr. Clark and the various leaders, 200 or 300 of us from around the world dealing with Africa in 1973. We were meeting with Chinese, European scholars. They all were focusing on Africa. But Sheikh Anta Diop wasn't there. Neither was Theophile Obenga, because they had already engaged the intellectual tradition of the French and other Europeans, and they had the famous Cairo Symposium. So while we were meeting with Emperor Haile Selassie and planning a larger reach of this knowledge, they were taking on the European tradition, and they won that battle. And as a result, UNESCO, the United Nations Economic, Social, and Cultural Organization, created a whole series of works based upon the new research, and those became an important triumph for Dr. Diop, Dr. Theophile Obenga, and a whole host of other Africans, scholars. Now that's at the level of international understanding. But this knowledge, if you do it using it culturally, has to come at all the levels. People's living styles, people's understanding of their history and tradition. So there'll be various levels where people will have brought together the knowledge that they have to speak about these things. And so some people may not want to change. And so all you can do is challenge them and then let them continue on their way until more knowledge and whatnot comes. If it doesn't come about, you can't force anybody to change.
But
we have fought to put this knowledge in the schools, in the research institutions, in the public schools as well as the universities, in the general flow of knowledge, and so it's been an Africanizing of our lives that has been the real foundation of what we're talking about. We're not talking about people who have mastered a little bit of the knowledge and can translate some of the definitions and miss the whole sweep of human history, where Africans have gone from not being human in all of the great institutions, in all of the great writings, in all of the spiritual statements. That's what we inherited before World War II. Since World War II, all of that has changed based upon scientific, cultural, and for example, our brother who went to study as an anthropologist, Ivan van Sertima, he realized that in order for him to do serious anthropology, where he's got to look at a whole array of history. So he looked at Africans in the New World. But then once he got into that, he had to link up the Africans out of Africa to Africans back into Africa. Once he realized how important this was, he wanted to produce a magazine. I encouraged him to do it. He did. Dr. Clark and others said we got enough magazines, but we didn't have one dealing specifically with African civilization. And so he produced it. It was successful, so Dr. Clark appreciated it, Asa, Dr. Hilliard, Dr. Carruthers, and then he even honored Dr. Ben with one of the issues, the second or third issue, because I wrote the statement on Dr. Ben for him, and others made their contribution. So there's an explosion of knowledge. It's coming at every level. Children's books, adult books, understanding of women. My wife combined with Van Sertima and others to produce a journal on African women.
Black women in antiquity.
Women in antiquity. So those who grab it and hold on to it and use it as a weapon and not use it to help grow and develop, we're unfortunate that may be the case.
One last segment, and because we're almost home. Okay, around this debate, there has been issues of character. People can agree to disagree. That's one thing. But there is an opinion where people don't know enough, and they need to retool and restudy to understand what they're talking about. But there's a process. There are academic rules that exist, and there are scholars that make decisions as to whether or not methodologies can go forward or not, or theses can go forward or not, and things like that. In this conversation, I had taken up the position that certainly that Kemet certainly is connected to black, great black. Kemet is connected to the sacred black cows, and because I disagree, my character has been insulted. I just need a statement from you, Dr. Jeffries, and maybe Mama J, about what is my relationship to this. What would you say as a teacher or professor of mine? What is my relationship to this work?
Well, certainly we're glad that you have been a part of this expanded African family of changing the history of our people to the truth. And fortunately, you've been there for all of us. And so not only have you been coming out of the Black Studies family at City College, which had an international Pan-African reach, you've worked with the elders who were guiding us, Dr. John Henry Clark, Dr. Joseph Ben-Jochannan. We trusted you to deal with them in the most intimate way, and you did it very proudly. You can claim to have nurtured all of us and continue to grow yourself while trying to nurture your peers. And
what projects have I been involved with? Because part of it will just say that's just proximity. I'm around. I just been hanging around, right? What is the work?
We wanted to make sure in the 70s and 80s that this knowledge impacted on how we educate, how we organize our people, how we educate our various family members. And you had a chance to move out of negative situations that were plaguing our people into positive ones. And you took a leadership role in that process, par excellence. Very few people have had a chance to have those type of leadership roles. I had them in the 60s and the 70s with Dr. Robinson, James H. Robinson, gave me responsibility, and that helped me grow. And that's why I was able to, for example, meet Dr. Shekhar Diop in 1959 and continue the growth. You have had that same process in which the closest with Dr. Clark and the closest with Dr. Ben, involved in the organization reaching out across the world, ASCAC, and then actually taking in '86 the lead in taking our precious responsibility. My nephew, Dr. Hassan went, Professor Small's oldest son, Dr. Malik went, and Dr. Clark's son, Malik went. You had the responsibility, Sony Ali, you had the responsibility of making sure that these youngsters were looked after, cared for, and that there was coordination between our activities and these young men.
So
there is a fantastic photo of the Ashantahini, the king of Ghana, with all of us around him. And there's Dr. Clark holding on to his son. There's myself with Malik, and also with Hassan. And your responsibility was to make sure that you provided the energy and the resources we needed. That was a learning experience.
So I was around, so some of the other things, the projects, the intellectual projects, the curriculum of inclusion.
The curriculum of inclusion was an important statement to the world that we're going to control the flow of knowledge of our people, at all levels, the home level, homeschooling, community level, grammar school, high school, university, research institutes, and you had a responsibility of working with all of us at that level.
The study groups across the country.
ASCAC study groups.
And across the world, because they were duplicated in Brazil and the Caribbean. They were duplicated
France.
in London and France. They were duplicated in England, Liverpool, London, and whatnot.
And
so,
just being at the Schomburg Library, which is like the center, you know.
Oh, they don't know. They don't know I worked at the Schomburg, but I worked at the Schomburg.
But the research there, that you were there, so that when the Schomburg was not willing to accept Malefica Santi and certain other folks,
as a new leader,
right?
Yeah.
But we remember that Reggie was there, and through the various departments. And he was very faithful, and he worked very hard. And for us, him being there was a great impact, and also on the young scholars.
Yeah,
so
because
that, what
in the
did that
technology,
mean?
he had the
that
computer
mean
technology and skills that helped us.
It means
and
that
others.
you couldn't just off the wall create your own hieroglyphics. I mean, you had the data and the material right there, the books and the research in front of you. People couldn't just make up little lies and to feel good about black things because you were there. And you were around, remembered, with the M3, the Melanin Conference. And so that the big studies there, we were talking, you're talking about Kim, as an artist, we realized that black, after a while, was not a color. Black, remember I'm saying
Yes.
is black is not a color. Then what is it? It's an essence.
Yes,
Black
technology.
is
chemistry,
an
yeah.
essence.
So out of the struggle that was going on in the 40s and 50s and exploded in the 60s and 70s, it reached another level in the 80s, because that's when we all went together with Dr. Ben, Francis Cress Welsing, Dr. Asa, Naim Akbar, Dr. Richard King, and all. We went to establish a study of the significance of
Wayne
melanin.
Chandler.
So 1987, we met in San Francisco in the Bay Area to look at this question of melanin. And then we spun off
Carol Barnes.
Every year we spun
Timothy,
off a conference. First in San Francisco, then in New York, then in Dallas, Washington, then in Dallas. So we've used this explosion of knowledge to help bring up the students, the professors, institutions, organizations,
And the black movement.
and the general black movement.
General black
Sekhmet, don't forget her too.
And certainly
And, dealing with psychology and mental
Right.
health.
a partner of Francis Cress Welsing.
So
was
it's been around.
Pat
Sekhmet,
Newton.
Pat
So
Newton,
you can
Dr.
confirm
Pat
for
Newton.
30 years. I haven't been around for proximity. I've been a part of whatever the work was, participating in the actual work, whatever the work was, whatever the project was.
Well, the beautiful thing was that you've been there when we needed you. When the whole question of the curriculum of inclusion came up and the people were here threatening us and
In front of your house.
in front of the house, but also threatening
In the
another part of
university,
town,
academic down in
Reverend
Rapids.
Daughtry.
Yes.
So we had to have security. And so for more than a year, young people led by yourself secured us.
But
at the same time, we kept doing the work, just like I was mentioning, that we were able to contact Reverend Butts, who understood what we were doing because he was a part of our program. And so we were able to have a community, putting the education in the community, using the church as a base, or other institutions such as the Schomburg or the County Cullen Library as a base. And so it wasn't just restricted to some lectures, it was a year process. And the idea was that at the end of the year, the 100 most important books about the black experience would be handled. You could purchase a book a week, 2 books a week, and that's what people did. At the end of the 2-week the process, there was 100 books, and then we took a pilgrimage to Africa, 100 and so people.
Because you're home, both of you are home, and you're home safe, and it's been late, and so I'm going to end this.
But I just wanted to say too that talking about home, you have always functioned on a very personal level. We spoke about the academic, the research, the institutions, but as part of family. In other words, when one of us, of the Sons of Africa, whoever's going to get married, you're there with the group, with the family. Funerals, just look at the list of funerals that have been, and where Reggie was right there with us, crying and sad when we're all sad. We, in turn, when your parents' funerals was in your personal family, we were all there.
So it's a family. It's an African family
affair.
It's an African family affair. So it's more than just little publications and scholarship and definitions. It's
if somebody's sick, one of us, you're at the hospital.
Yeah.
It's a social transformation and a cultural rise that we've had. In the 50s and 60s, you had the revolutionary component. They called it the Black Revolution. In the 70s and 80s, it got into the intellectual realm, and that was a struggle for what this knowledge might mean for all of our people. And in the 80s and 90s, we took it internationally. So you're talking about the Black Revolution, you're talking about the Renaissance. But before the Renaissance period, you had reparations, what we would do ourselves. And so we're now in the period of rebirth and renaissance.
And don't forget, when we're talking about these international things, who was there at the United Nations with us when Dr. Ambassador Tangara was there to begin to receive us and to talk about what? Leonard and I went to Senegambia, the home of Alex Haley, with Ambassador, in order to prepare for the speech and the dialogue at the United Nations to prove the impact of reparations that was needed. And at the finality of all of that travel and years of this, that, and the other, at the United Nations, who was there with us at the United Nations? Reggie Mabry.
Right. So it's some people look at this work as individual small components, and some people look at it as a larger interconnected component, right? And that's the work that we do. So I want to thank you. The conversation can go on and on. I want to thank both my elders, my mom and my pop, because it's my revolutionary, my academic, scholarly, my mentors. Because I've tried to engage these young people. I tried to be a bridge between them, wherever they are, and the academic world. I mean, I'm someone who worked with you on civilization of barbarism. Did I work with you on civilization of barbarism?
You certainly did, and you helped to mobilize. People don't understand. You have your teaching responsibility. That ends at 9:30. And then at 9:30 at night, that's when you get into serious other things. And so we'd be leaving. If we left at 12, we were lucky, at midnight. And then we'd leave at 1 o'clock, drop Professor Scobie off, and then we'd take you all the way up to the Castle Hill Project so that you could get your rest.
So I just wanted people to understand the bigger dynamics in doing the work instead of just having some small non-connected arguments about who's right or who's wrong. That this is a bigger conversation. Thank you, Mama J. Thank you, Dr. J. The struggle continues.
We want to thank Brother Charles.
Of course, brother.
For moving us through all of this.
You have time left on there. It's all done.
And,
it's almost done, but you're gonna ride me home so we can talk.
Yeah.
All right. So
it's been.
Let me open up the doors for them.
Right.
Yes.
It's been a great struggle and a great success. We are now at the point where the various forces coming from Asia and coming from white supremacy are attempting to make another control over African people.
That's correct. Another Berlin conference.
We need to use this knowledge we have of who and what we are to form, as I have tried to do in my life, to be a Pan-African bridge over troubled African waters.
Great statement. Good night.